that are viewing this a bit of a geographical lesson, I guess, of where Shiloh Baptist Church is located. Um, I know and you know, but could you kind of give us a background from back then of where Shiloh was located within the black community?
Well, Shiloh lies in the oldest black, historically black community in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is the Warnersville community. It was founded immediately after slavery when Herman Unthank, who was a Quaker, actually came to Greensboro and purchased some land, and eventually sold his lands off to who had been or what had been former slaves. And so this was the first community in Greensboro where the blacks actually began to own their own homes. And so Shiloh has been a part of this community now for 127 years, and we are fortunate we have not had to leave the community. Redevelopment has come through our community, but we are actually only a block, well, actually on our campus now is the grounds where the building that I grew up in was located. And then, of course, we are probably less than and not far from there is the original church building. So we haven't moved at all, really.
That is a rarity. As you know, obviously it is something that is a huge accomplishment and to be very thankful for. Um, with where you guys are located and it's so close to being in the center of downtown Greensboro, um, can you kind of give a timeline of you seeing it morph over from desegregation to integration? As a child, as you stated, you were sitting in the balcony, or you were made to sit in the balcony because you weren't allowed to sit with whites at the movie theater. Can you kind of give us your first moments dealing with integration within the school system and I guess daily life?
Sure. The first part, one of the most noticeable memories of recall about integration for us, or me personally, of course, is when we were able to sit downstairs at that time in the Carolina Theater. My sister, who may have also been interviewed by you as part of this project, was older, and one of the things she did was make sure that she took me and we sat downstairs in the main area of the theater. Of course, this was one of the advent of the desegregation movement. Uh, Unbeknownst to me, even before that, my sister, I was young. My sister is 13 years older, so she had actually taken me down when she was marching and protesting in the civil rights sit-in movements in 1960, unbeknownst to my parents as well. And so I was actually a part of that, not knowing and not being of my own free will, perhaps, at that time. Also got to experience, if you want to stop it for a second, I'll turn the phone off. Okay, let me just silence this so it won't interrupt us again. You forget about you have these things until go back and edit it. You get your first editing. How about that? 1 second.
Not shaking it. Yeah, Lord, I'm too sorry.
Okay, it's not touching the chair.
Okay.
Okay.
Also, just like watch your hands.
Oh, is it coming in?
A little bit.
Okay.
As long as they stay where your notebook is.
Okay.
Hang on right here.
Okay. All right. Let's go back on. I guess go back on camera. Uh, as a child, the first formative years of my education period was segregated. I went to public school my first grade year, but I had to travel out of city because my birthday fell beyond the cutoff point. So I actually went to school out of town the first grade year, so I didn't have to get held back. But from the second grade year, I was back in the public school system, which was in the black community. And then the third through the eighth grade, I was pretty much isolated or insulated because I was in a Catholic school setting, and we were all blacks, but we had white nuns, white priests at the school. But we traveled and played the white basketball teams for the white Catholic parishes. And so we actually traveled, to High Point, played both of the white parishes here in Greensboro. We went to Thomasville. We went to Burlington, playing the black schools in High Point and Burlington, black Catholic parishes. So that was still kind of a segregated, but we mixed in the basketball arena. But in terms of integration itself, the earliest memories of school came pretty much when the desegregation efforts came. Even then, preliminary was something called freedom of choice, which really was a misnomer. There was no freedom of choice. What it actually, if blacks wanted to go to schools with whites, we had to, and my experience was, I lived in southeast Greensboro, so we had to take the public bus transportation because they would not send a bus to pick us up to take us to integrate the schools. But I had to take 2 buses. My 9th grade year, I went to Mendenhall, which is located over in northwest Greensboro, or north side of town. And so that meant that I had to catch a bus on McConnell Road, Duke Power Bus. That means we had to pay our own fare. We went downtown, which is now right down, it used to be a Belk's right in the center downtown, not far from where the Lincoln Financial or Jefferson Standard building is located. And then we would change buses, and the bus would take us as far down as Page High School, down Elm Street. And then we would have to walk to Mendenhall, which was located off of Willoughby. And that was the experience for us under so-called freedom of choice. Now, the 10th grade year, I opted to come back to the black community to go to Dudley High School, which was established in 1929. It is the school, black high school, the high school in the city for blacks. And, of course, in Dudley, we had the vestiges of segregation in the sense that many of the books we had were hand-me-down books, discarded books from Grimsley. In fact, I distinctly still remember seeing the old chemistry books that they had no longer used, but they sent us for us to use at Dudley. But to counter that, we also were blessed to have black teachers primarily who cared about us and who would not settle for mediocrity and who took the liberty of not only teaching us the subject matters that they were supposed to be teaching us, but also encouraged us with black history that was not in the textbooks, and who were themselves at the vanguard of fighting for desegregation and integration and civil rights in our community. So we were blessed, even in the midst of the segregation, in the midst of not having the latest funding or adequate funding.
Like we spoke before, the interview comes full circle. I actually went to Mendenhall myself, so I know exactly what you're talking about. Let's see here. Well, one question we were going to ask is, how did you begin getting involved in civil rights? But you've obviously stated that your sister, unbeknownst to you, you were tagging along at a very early age to these protests and sit-in movement. Could you give us, I guess, a memory that you may or may not have from your childhood when you were at those events?
Well, one of the things I remember most, I guess, I grew up under a pastor who was prophetic and not only preached about justice, but it was a person that helped to bring it about here in Greensboro. He served many capacities. One of them was he was also on the Board of Education. At that time, Gifford County, Greensboro had a separate Board of School system. Gifford County had a school system, and High Point had a school system. So you actually had 3 different school systems in Gifford County, but he was on the Greensboro Board of Education. And one of my earliest memories as a high school student was I actually went down to the Board of Education speaking in the Board of Education, at the Board of Education meeting about integration. What happened, of course, after my sophomore year at Dudley is when we actually had what would be called desegregation to take place. In other words, the 10th grade year, we were pretty much still an all-black high school. The 10th grade is when the Greensboro school system formally desegregated after that year. So the next year, we actually had white students and black students. Well, white students were bused into the black community, or the poor whites that did Bessemer primarily, the Bessemer area, which is over near what is now Irwin Middle School in that area. That's when white flight took place in Greensboro. Now, the Phillips Avenue corridor was where Whitmere Park was all white back then. And when the forcible desegregation took place, then they sold all their homes. They gave the homes away. And so now what you see as a black community was white when I was a little boy, and because it was white flight taking effect, and they were going to the county schools. But the poor whites,
Yes, sir.
they couldn't just get up and go.
Yes, sir.
So they're the ones who actually got bused primarily to Dudley. And of course, many of my classmates who were in the black community went to Grimsley, got Smith sent to Page. And of course, some blacks had voluntarily started going to Smith under the so-called freedom of choice to integrate Smith. So that was part of our experience. I remember speaking out distinctly at the Board of Education meeting during that period of time. In terms of how we are treated differently, one of the most noticeable differences perhaps in my life, for me personally, when I graduated from high school at Dudley, I was salutatorian. That means I graduated number 2 in my class. During that time in Greensboro, they had something called Greensboro Brains Team. And they would put all the valedictorians and salutatorians from all the high schools in the newspaper. What happened to me was I was actually working that summer, finishing high school, at Justice Drug Company, a local drug company here in Greensboro. I was the only black employee, young student. There were 3 of us, particularly I remember. The other 2 were white. But when we went to that drug company, they decided they need to have somebody to clean the bathrooms. And guess who they chose? Thought it would be the best candidate to be the one to clean the bathrooms. So it just so happened that I think the day they asked me to assume that duty. That's not what I was hired for, by the way. We were all hired to do the same job, but they decided that was a job that I could do well. And of course, that same day they asked, they had the newspaper article came out. Now here I am in the newspaper, one's at that time supposedly one of the brightest young students in Greensboro. And so I just gave my notice. I quit and decided that wasn't what my pathway was going to be. Not because it's not honorable to clean, but because I shouldn't have to be a custodian because of my race. Now, I say that with all pride. My father was a custodian, and I wouldn't be where I am today but for the sacrifices that my dad made for me and my mother. But nobody should prescribe to me a certain job that I've got to do because of the color of my skin. All right? So that's some of my inexperiences with racism at that level during that period of time. Now, there are always, as you grow, you live while black. And we are living in a society that is still race conscious. And as long as you're living in the United States of America, we have not gotten to that point yet where it is not race conscious. So don't think that living while black is something new, a new phenomenon. Your parents, your grandparents have all had to experience it in their generation, just as you're experiencing it. Unfortunately, it rears its ugly head when we think we're making progress against racism and bigotry and prejudice. But we've seen now that it has not died. It's still prevalent.
I'll ask this, but we've already heard some of it on what drives you as a pastor and as an activist. But as you just stated, you wouldn't be where you are today if it wasn't for your mom and your dad's sacrifices. So you obviously came from humble beginnings, like most do, within this community. Are they a continuing force on what drives you, or were there other people along the way besides your pastor as well that?
Well, I've been blessed. I've been blessed. I grew up in this church. This church, one of its gifts, and I say that frequently, is it has always encouraged its youth. Early on, my former pastor, J.T. Harrison, was a pillar in this community. He pastored here for 53 years. He valued education. Many times taking money out of his own pockets to help students go to get a college education. When he died, this church implemented a scholarship fund where, again, we encouraged youth to get education. I was a beneficiary of that when I was here, but more importantly, of people saying that, you can be somebody and encouraging me and let me know that that I had the chance to be whatever God would have me to be in this world. And so that has been a major driver. There's so many people that was my case in life. But I was also blessed as I went along the way to have teachers that had profound impact on me. Undeniably, Otis L. Harrison left his mark in my life. I tell people, they think I'm radical. No, I'm not radical. Otis Harrison was a radical, okay? So whatever you see me doing, I'm mild compared to this giant that helped birth me spiritually. But I will say that there were some school teachers along the way, even in that Catholic school setting, who encouraged me. The reason I got to Mendenhall was because as I was coming out of Catholic school, they called my mother in and let her understand that I had tested really well under standardized testing, and they thought it would be wise for my mother to send me over to Mendenhall. Whereas otherwise, I wouldn't have gone to Mendenhall. That's why I ended at Mendenhall, because that's not to say that that's where I couldn't have done well at Lincoln, which was probably where I would have gone if I hadn't gone to Mendenhall. But those teachers took an interest in my development as well. And then when I came back to Dudley, now at Mendenhall I had some people, good teachers, that were, again, the experience in education, the expectations. I was there sitting with only a few blacks in the honors classes, but those of us who, had some good teachers, and some that even today, when I later on in life, remembered me. And yet, when I came back to Dudley, I'll say great, profound impact. I had English teachers and other teachers that really made a difference in my life. And when I went to A&T State University, I'm a proud Aggie. Had a chance to go other institutions, could have gone free, had scholarships, and one of the best decisions I ever made was to go to A&T State University. And I went on a chancellor scholarship. That means that I got my education free, but it also meant that I was able to have some great teachers there that poured into my life, that have lifelong friends today, that have been with me 43 years later, and still a part of my life, and supported me as I developed my career professionally after that.
That is just shows
And
how
let me-
important planting seeds.
And let me just go a little further, if you don't mind. I think also, as I left from A&T, A&T was kind of like the cocoon where, again, you're nurtured and developed for me. And then I left professionally. My next journey was to go into law. I went to University of North Carolina School of Law at Chapel Hill, and it was there that, again, I experienced racism's ugly head. It was there in 1976, the bicentennial year of our country, where we were saluting this nation and independence, and sitting there where, in a classroom where I would be on the second row, not the back row, the second row. And it might be four of us who happened to be of color. That's all we had in common. We just happened to be black. And we were sitting on the second row. And it was our experience that we would have a white professor to call on every white student till they got to the colored person or the black person. Come down the other row, call on every white student till they got to the colored person. And they would just pass us by. 1976. And there were times even when we spoke, when we would give an answer and it was like we were not even there. We hadn't said a word. But my classmate behind me, who happened to be Caucasian, could say the exact same thing. And the professor said, "Oh, that's brilliant." And the black student said, "Steve, didn't you just say that?" I said, "I must have been speaking Spanish because apparently I couldn't be." But living while black is not something that's just something that the millennials incur. But the good news is that we were able to survive and to thrive. And I was blessed. I talk about God puts people in your lives so that when I left that place, my next stop was, it just so happened that God had put a black judge on the North Carolina Court of Appeals. He was the very first black since Reconstruction. His name was Richard C. Irwin. He was a former black former state legislator in the North Carolina House, and he was appointed by Governor Jim Hunt to be the first black to serve in the North Carolina Court of Appeals. When I was coming out of law school, I was looking for a career opportunity, and he chose me to be his research assistant. So my first job out of Carolina Law School was a coveted job, one that most of the black and most of the white students, all law students sought. It was a plum job. I had the chance to do that job, and he was my mentor. And he was like a father figure for me. And so that when I got ready to leave and come out and practice law, he gave me all of his books that he had in his law office, so I didn't have to go out and spend money to buy stuff that would be very hard for a solo practitioner to have, set up a law practice. So those are some of the people that have impact on my life.
I'm in shock right now just from hearing all of it, because like you said, God will put people in your path to help you go where you need to be, and to help plant and water those seeds to make you the person you're supposed to grow into. So I'm shocked. I like hearing this stuff. Well, I guess one question we could ask is, you've already told us the barriers that you face all throughout the education that you received. When you returned home as a black lawyer, what barriers did you face then?
Oh, one of the barriers was even where you could put your office. Let me back up. Even before then, I was getting ready to come out of law school, as I told you. During that period of time, there were very few white law firms that would hire black lawyers in North Carolina. Very few. Norman Smith's law firm was one of the few firms. Most of the integrated firm was Julius Chambers' law firm in Charlotte. But most blacks could not get hired in predominantly white law firms. While I was in law school, I took a trial advocacy course. I was the best student in that course. A white law firm, a prominent law firm in Charlotte, called the law professor and said, look, we're looking to hire somebody in litigation for our law firm. And can you recommend someone? Well, they didn't. The law firm, this predominant law firm in Charlotte, didn't realize that his best student happened to be black, a student of color. And so the law professor called me and said, well, this law firm is looking to hire somebody in litigation, and they'll be interviewing at Carolina's law school tomorrow. And gave me the appointment time for my interview and all. When I walked in that interview room, that law recruiter from that law firm was shocked that this best student was black. And you know what he told me? He said, I'm sorry, we're not hiring anyone in litigation this year. We're looking for someone in estate planning. That's what happened. And I was graduating. I finished Carolina Law School early. I finished in December of 1978, 2.5 years. That was in the fall of 1978. But God has a way that's mighty sweet. I got a plum job, as I told you. I came back home to practice law. I opened up my own law firm. One of the problems is, where you practice law. Now, there are many thoughts about that. One of the thoughts was whether or not I would open up an office downtown. At that time, the only black law firm that was downtown was Fry, Barbie, and Gervais, which Henry Fry, who went on, of course, to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. They went into the Southeastern building. And I guess Elrita, she was judging when I came home. Elrita Alexander was judging at that point. But I was looking, and so one of the places, there was other beginning lawyers who had their law offices in the Jefferson Standard building. And so I decided I would go and look, see about possibly moving in the Jefferson Standard building. And we went down there. My wife and I went to look at this possible space. And young white lawyers, my same age group, starting out, had their offices in there. And one of the questions that the guy was concerned about was my clientele, who my clientele would be. Well, don't you know that these young white lawyers and other older established white lawyers who were in there were representing black folks? So why was it a problem with my clientele if these white firms could represent black folks and take our money? But it was a problem only if I would, if I would be able to rent down there. You talk about living while black in Greensboro. As a young lawyer, I was involved in community issues. One of the issues was dealing with my alma mater. At Dudley, we had a beloved athletic director who was removed from his position, and the community felt passionately about that. And so, as I was one of the leaders of that group who were upset about his being removed, and we went down to a school board meeting. Well, I got a certified letter from the school board that basically saying that if we disrupt the school board meeting, that they would prosecute us criminally. Now, could you imagine them sending that kind of letter to the white community? Somebody from Grimsley coming down there to complain about something. If Grimsley had displeasure, or Page had displeasure, or Kaiser had displeasure, if the white parents and the white community from the white communities were to come down to a school board meeting, no, that letter never would have been sent. Never in a million years. But that's the type of things that you live with, whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, it doesn't matter. You're still black in this community. And so, of course, those are some of the struggles that we were involved in. In my practice, I actually did racial discrimination work. I did sex discrimination work. I did Title VII. I had a general practice. I was a trial lawyer. Then I also did wills and estates and personal injuries, those other things. And I did criminal defense. So in those capacities, I think I had a chance to make a difference. I know so because when we first started out, again, trying cases in our community, it was the norm to have all white juries. Not because there weren't black jurors in the community, but because they used unlawful means of peremptory challenges to take black jurors away from the judicial system so that they would not have the right to sit on certain types of cases. So black attorneys had to be better than the norm in order to obtain justice, because we knew that anytime we went in a courtroom, the debt was going to be stacked, because we weren't even going to have many times a jury of peers, simply because our black jurors would be removed on account of race. So therefore, we had to learn to cultivate our craft in a context where justice was blind to the poor. Justice was blind to those who were of color. And we had to try to be David fighting against Goliath to make sure that there was justice in the courthouse and that there was fairness in the process. And the system was stacked by the way that even the election and selection of judges, so much so that you could not even get to be certain types of judges because of what we're seeing right now. The gerrymandering that is being done by this present crowd was being done by the Democratic crowd when they had control to keep blacks from being able to be judges, so that the way the judges were selected, Superior Court judges, the only reason the blacks got to participate by and large was because of a lawsuit that was filed challenging the selection method. And again, God has a way that's mighty sweet, because I was one of the first black judges in the state of North Carolina that was elected to serve as a Superior Court judge. There were 8 of us that were elected in the 1988 election. And so the system of justice changed almost completely, because now you had persons who happened to be of black color who were now going to hold court in 100 counties in North Carolina. And not only was it going to be, it wasn't going to be an aberration. There were special Superior Court judges that were only selected to serve for 4 years. They were appointed by the governor. And the very first person to serve as a special Superior Court judge was Sammy Chess in High Point. He was appointed by Governor Bob Scott. But in 1988, now statewide, 8 of us were elected at one time. And there were additionally some other blacks who were not elected from a primarily black district. So actually, it ended up with about 10 of us. And so now for 6 months, you might have a black judge, and then another black judge might come out, because in Eastern North Carolina, they had several of them. And now they're rotating around. So if one leaves, you got another one coming. And it made a difference in the way justice was administered. Now people couldn't treat you like your boys, like your dogs. One of our great North Carolina Chief Justice, who happened to be white, was known for talking about if you lay down with dogs, you're bound to catch fleas. And she was talking about laying down with a black person, a white woman laying down for a black man. But now, when black judges are on the bench, there has to be a different decorum. Now they can't do business as usual. Now you can command respect for every citizen that comes in that courtroom. And so now, judging while black, you're still black. So now you got the experience of going to whole court in places where they never had, or very rarely had, black judges. So I know in one of my occasions, I went to whole court in Concord, and when I went to whole court in Concord, they didn't hear me. They said, "Oh, we got a nigger judge coming in here now." It was a deputy sheriff. And he had to come and apologize, because I heard him, and the sheriff made him come in and apologize for the comments. Well, I went to whole court in one place, Lincolnton, and when I went to whole court in Lincolnton, I went to Park, and back then what judges had was a special tag. And this special tag was, let everybody know you're a Superior Court, or a judge, period. Whether you're Superior Court, District Court, doesn't matter. But particularly Superior Court judge. So I went to whole court in Lincolnton. When I went to drive up and park the judge's space, the bailiff was there, and he was flagging me down. "You can't park here, you can't park here, that's for the judge." And of course, he wasn't expecting a black Superior Court judge, because that would be a rarity up in Lincoln County, North Carolina, going up towards the mountains. And of course, I just calmly got out of the car, pulled right into space, and told him, "Look at my tag. I am the judge." And so happened, so these are some of the experiences that you have, that you are able to. But then let me tell you something else good, just so you can see what happens by having the fortitude and being blessed by God. I also had the privilege, my first tour of duty as a Superior Court judge was to go to Randolph County. Randolph County had never had a black judge, didn't have many black attorneys. They had attorneys from Randolph County, but some of them had satellite offices, but not full-time presence there. And that was my first assignment. That was during a time where many of the communities did not have what was called a first offenders program. That seems to be it started here in Gifford County. Again, it started by a black judge named Elrita Alexander Ralston, who implemented it in her courtroom as a district court judge, and it later became a statewide program. But in any event, you could go 20 miles outside of Gifford County and have a different brand of justice. What would be treated here in Gifford County, where you get a second chance, maybe to keep a clean record, there was no program like that in Alamance County. There was no program like that in Rockham County. There was no program like that in Randolph County. So, long story short, Randolph County I go. In Greensboro, I go to whole court the first time in Randolph County, Superior Court judge. They call up a black kid, and back during that period of time, they were using blacks, 15-year-olds, out on the streets to sell drugs. That's what the drug dealers were doing. They knew that they didn't have a criminal record. They'd get popped. But when they got popped in these other counties, they were getting treated like felons, so they would get popped, they would have a small amount, not get a first offenders program, and they had to plead to a felon. And that was when my first cases come up. But then the same thing happened, but the next time it came up was a white kid with the same offense. And they wanted to break his offense down to something different. And I called the DAs up to the car. I said, "No, wait a minute, we're going to feed out the same spoon. Now, you just had this case here, and you can't treat this kid, same facts, pretty much. The only difference is race." And so because I was in that courtroom, a different brand of justice started being administered. And it made a difference. How do I know it made a difference? Because my last tour of duty as a Superior Court judge happened to be in Randolph County 8 years later. My first term of court, Randolph County. My last term of court, Randolph County. And you know what they did? The last day of my court, my day of judgeship, the Bar Association of Randolph County, who didn't have any black members in the bar, stopped at my court session, and they came and presented me with a Kinney rocking chair. They told me they had only presented this rocking chair to one other judge in the county's history. That judge had been their resident Superior Court judge for over 30-something years, and me. This young judge from Greensboro, North Carolina, who happened to be black. It makes a difference, the way that the judges do justice in the counties. I haven't been a judge for 22 years. People still call me judge today. I could go to communities I've held court, and they stop me and say, Judge Allen, today. I just left today from been Winston-Salem, coming from Winston-Salem, for something I did as a judge. They asked me to come back over there because of somebody's life that I sent to prison. But he said if I hadn't sent him to prison, that he'd be dead. He changed his life. He reached out to me and asked me to come over there. Actually, 12 years ago when I started preaching, one of the first calls I got as a young preacher was he wanted me to come back to a program that they're doing over there to try to get drug dealers to stop dealing drugs, to change their lives and to become productive citizens. And he says to me, if I hadn't sent him to prison, he'd be dead now. He thanked me. And today, 5 years, 10, 12 years later, I get a call this week and say, look, can you come over here? We're doing this program. I want you here again today. So today I got to stand and talk to kids who may be gangbangers, kids who may be, drug dealers, and I got to speak a word of encouragement to them, to tell them that they have opportunities and chances and that they can be somebody in their lives and that they can make choices other than the streets.
Reverend Allen, I just take a moment to say thank you so much for, number one, giving us this interview, but all that you've done within the community. And I know that Reverend Harrison is very proud of you, looking down on you, and just it shows you when, let me back up a second, when you're black, you have to be twice as good as everyone else to get half of what they get. And you know very well what that's like, and it's living while black. You know how hard we have to work within our own community just to get half of what white communities or other communities get. So the fact that you've made so many strides in your lives and so much progress and changed so many people's lives, it's inspiring, and we are so grateful for it. We have one, this is probably going to seem like a loaded question for you, but one final question to kind of touch base on is, how do you feel about the newer movements, like the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, my son actually was one of the leaders of the Black Lives movement here in Greensboro community, so I'm well aware of it. Many of the meetings that the Black Lives Matters movement are held here at Shiloh Baptist Church, or have been held here at Shiloh Baptist Church. Each generation has to deal with the prejudice and the discrimination that it sees, and it has the right to speak out in a way that they can be heard. Obviously, it's their time to, they're hurting, they're tired, and they're being recognized, and they're becoming the voice of this generation. Each generation has to have its own voice. And so I'm an elder statesman, so somewhat. They're elder people here. I'm still active in the NAACP. I am a member of the executive committee locally. I'm a member of the statewide executive committee. I'm also a member of the Pulpit Forum. And in those different spheres, we interact with the youth of today, the millennial group, and the struggle. And the struggle is common. It's a common struggle. So you have the right to speak, to be heard. Many times they turn to us because they can't fight the struggle alone. There are places that we can go and be heard simply by the virtue of the struggles we've already been engaged in, and by so that some of the people that need to hear you will hear you simply because we're in the room. with you.
I have a two-parter question for you. If you could go back in time and speak to your younger self prior to, let's say prior to the 10th grade, what would you tell yourself? And then an added to that question is, what would you tell the next generation to come? Any words of wisdom for how to live or how to be activists within the community?
You know, I'm blessed
Yes, sir.
because what happened to me was early on. See, I was an avid reader, and I didn't. You know, you talk about people making impact. See, when I grew up, you talk about discrimination again. I was blessed because, you know, at the time, I forgot to tell you about the Carnegie Negro Library, which was on Bennett College's campus. And again, the black folks had to go to Bennett College to go to the library because we weren't able to go access the public library system. But my next door neighbor took me religiously to Bennett College because we didn't have a car when I was little. And my next door neighbor, they had a car. And so she would take me and take my mother with me so we could go down to the library so I could get books. And so I read everything I could, and it was several times a week. And it was in that I got exposed, and she helped share me, you know, to share books with me. So I was reading. By the time I'm in the 6th grade, I'm reading about Malcolm X. By the time I'm in the 6th grade, I'm reading The Spook Who Sat by the Door, Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison, all those books. And then I'm attuned to the civil rights movement. I'm reading about Thurgood Marshall. And so my young self, at 11, 10, 11, I'm already formed, really, in the context of where I want to be. And what I was toying with, would blow your mind, was between being a preacher and a lawyer.
And you did both.
And so I just happened to follow the pathway I wanted first, and then God brought me right to where he wanted me to be. So follow your passion, expand your mind. You could encourage young folks to take advantage of opportunities that come to them. Develop your talents, and wherever your passions lies, pursue your passions. Now, we don't know where you're going to end up. Life is changing. No one has one career path anymore. It's not like it used to be growing up. People don't keep the same job 40 years or 30 years. You're going to have different career paths. Maybe I can't keep a job, okay? I've been many things. I was a lawyer for 8 years. I became a Superior Court judge for 8 years. I went back and practiced law for 23 years. And then now this is my 8th year of being the pastor of this church. So everything happens in 8 years of my lives, except for the practice of law, which I went back to for 23 years. So who knows where I will be the next, segment. But just follow your passions and your dreams, and try to be the best. Well, I will say this, and this is it. Whatever job you have, do it well. This is another story you probably ought to tape, but I can tell you that this is off the tape, so it doesn't really matter. But what I will say to you is this. Part of my blessing was that every job I had, I did well. One of my jobs, I didn't tell you, but I was a bag boy at Kroger's. And when I was a bag boy at Kroger's, it is now where Martin Luther King Drive is, and it's now where it used to be where Shipman's Family Products is, but now where you see the bus transportation company down there, where the MLK parade starts, that used to be Kroger's shopping center. And I was a bag boy there in high school. I was a good bag boy. I took pride in my work. I did the job well. Because I did that job well, I got my next job. One of my customers owned the dry cleaners. And she asked me, did I want to come work for her and her husband in the dry cleaners? Now, they were members of this church, but they asked me, she said, well, you come sit down and talk with my husband. And if I did. I went and sit down with him. They hired me. Now, I told you I had walked out of Justice Drug Company when they asked me to sweep, to become a custodian. Well, I went to work at Burnett's Dry Cleaners, which was located on East Market Street, not far from A&T's campus. Well, I started that job that summer between high school and college. they would trusted me enough so that I would open up, I would close up, and they eventually would take vacations and leave me in charge. They treated me like I was their son. We would work, we would get the clothes pressed, we would get the clothes assembled. You always have downtime when people come to pick up the clothes. So on Saturdays, I'm sitting there with Mr. Burnett, because Miss Burnett would go home right after we finished the pressing, and he would talk to me, just like we're sitting here talking today, about life, about his life experience, just about life in general, speaking encouraging words into my life. And he treated me just like I was his son. He had a daughter, they didn't have a son. Because of working hard at the dry cleaners, now I'm going to A&T, when I would come and work sometimes when they need me, at the dry cleaners, just like we're sitting here today, on a Saturday, we sit down and talk, and he understood I wanted to go to law school. So you know what he said to me? He said, when you go off to law school, when you get ready to come back home, we will take you down to the bank. At that time, they were co-founders of Greensboro National Bank, which was the black bank. And we'll take you down to the bank and sign for you to get a loan to open up your law practice. That's exactly what happened in my life. When I finished my clerkship in Raleigh, I wanted to come back home to practice law. I called up Mr. and Mrs. Burnett, who owned Burnett's Dry Cleaners. I went to their house. I had prepared a budget. I needed $20,000 to open up my law practice. I told them my business plan. I showed them my business plan. And then they took me down to Greensboro National Bank, and they signed for me to get a loan so that I could open up my law practice. That's what happens when you do each job that you have well. Don't know what you're just trying to do the job you have now well. But if you do that job well, you never know where you'll end up. I wouldn't be where I am today without all of those people who poured into me. Those are unsung heroes in my life. Those are the people that made a difference. And there are others. With this interview doesn't give time permit for me to call their names. But there are others that I wouldn't be where I am today but for their kindness and their mercies towards me.
I have 102 minutes left.
We're good. We can still talk that. We'll play around with editing throughout this, but that was amazing. We appreciate that, all that you told us. I'll ask a few somewhat redundant questions now based off of the target interview questions they wanted us to ask. One would be, during this time period of civil rights and integration and desegregation, was someone close to you ever a victim of violent actions against your race that you can recall?
Let's see. I'm blessed in the sense that I shouldn't even be sitting here. I really shouldn't. One of the things happened my first day of college at A&T. We had registered, and we had been bus drivers. I was a bus driver in high school as well, and so a lot of us were former bus drivers, and we were down at that park right off of Phillips Avenue, Woodmere Park, Kings Forest area, probably Kings Forest Park probably. And we were just sitting down there, and we'd all registered for the first day of classes, and one of our younger friends had younger brothers of one of my friends had gone to the curb market right there at the corner of Elwell and Bessemer. It's a little curb market right there. And when he went in there, it was a white gentleman who came out, and this white gentleman pulled a gun on him. And so he came down to where we were, and he told his older brother and us, and we all, being young, went back to where this incident happened. Now, back then, I told you one of my aspirations was to be a lawyer, right? I was always a peacemaker. And so my friends were very upset, and we'd been drinking some beer. And so the beer, he had more beer, and he was ready to, and the white gentleman was still there. The guy had pulled the gun. And so we went back, and the guy came out of the store, and So we asked him, why did you pull this gun on this high school student? And he was an older gentleman. He wasn't a young guy. Anyway, he was probably in his 20s or 30s, but a high school student, this guy pulled a gun on him. And lo and behold, this is where I began my negotiation skills, because my friends wanted to fight, and I got between them, and I'm trying to de-escalate it. And so I push, I'm negotiating this thing, de-escalating it, and get him to go back. And the guy says he's sorry, and he didn't mean to pull the gun. And so we get the guy who wants, to back off, and so he drops his cigarettes, and he wants to get. I said, no, you go back and get it. And all my friends are pulling him back. So again, and I bend down to pick the cigarettes up. This guy pulls the gun on me. And it was in that period of time that you talk about life, your life goes down in slow motion. In that span of time, I could see it looked like life just went down in slow motion for me. And I'm bending down to pick the cigarettes. The gun is pulled on me. But thanks be to God, my friends did not abandon me at that moment. And they came back, and the guy put his gun up. And I'm still here, a witness to tell about it today. There are other instances, but that one is vivid. And I'll just say, you talk about grace and mercy. I'm a living witness of grace and mercy. I shouldn't be here. In terms of personal violence, fortunately, most of the incidences of violence, of the Klan Nazi, other than the incident in '79, but most of the personal lynching and stuff had stopped in the Greensboro community at that time. If anything, the format of the violence that took place became in the context of the police brutality situations. And one of the things I did in my litigation life, I told you as an attorney, was I took civil rights cases. And so I began to file lawsuits against cities, municipalities, sheriff's departments, and police departments that engaged in racial discrimination. And so that was how I was able to fight back against discrimination.
Trying to see, on the questions, because I know you've touched base on a bunch. So I guess the next question I could ask is, from this target question, is have you witnessed the progression or regression of interactions amongst our race? So, as you stated, every generation has their own set of issues that are similar that need to be fought. And we have our own battles to face. But do you think that we're moving forward as a race, or if we're moving backward?
Unfortunately, I think we have a 50-year cycle in our country where we repeat the past. I told you about law school. When I came to practice law here in 1980, I opened up a law practice. As a young attorney, one of the things I did was get involved in the major bar association at that time. You had Greensboro Bar Association, which was predominantly white. You had a few blacks. But in the mid-'80s, one of the things I won't ever forget was we had a former ACC referee who was in charge of referees for the Atlantic Coast Conference, who came to speak at the Greensboro Bar Association meeting, which was held at the Country Club. I was probably one of only 3 blacks in attendance at that meeting back then, and I was the first black to serve as president of the Greensboro, the youth division of the Greensboro Bar Association, but or young adults, the young bar, and but in any event, so I was at a meeting that night, and this particular name, who this person is now deceased, but he was very prominent. If I called his name, everybody would know it, and he came to be the guest speaker that night. And then he made some racially disparaging remarks, jokes. And you would not expect a person from the ACC at the time where you had black athletes who were now not commonplace to make the kind of remarks that he made at the Greensboro Bar Association meeting. So much so that after that meeting, the next day, they came to my law office to apologize for his behavior. And so, I mean, each generation is going to experience racism because we have this sickness in our society. I told you about speaking out at the school board meeting when I was about, I guess I was technically 16. I was a school bus driver then. And what stood out in my mind was, as a school bus driver, I was assigned to that area where the poor whites lived. And I drove a route that was in that Bessemer community, but off of Ward Road. And I never will forget because I picked up that particular route going to the elementary school for Irwin Elementary School. A young white child got on the bus that day. She said, "Steve, are you prejudiced?" And I said, "I try not to be." She said, "Well, we're supposed to be." But that's what was being taught to her in that home setting. And so that stuck me. I mean, still to this day, that rings with me because that's what she was being taught in her home setting, was that she was supposed to be prejudiced and not like blacks. And so when I went down to that school board meeting, that's what I told them in that school board meeting. You know, this is the context of what we have to deal with in our society, and we ought to be past this. But as long as you have people who keep breeding that, that's what we're seeing reborn right now in this this second wave of this rebirth of this. You know, they're using different code words. They're using different, but it means the same. And Make America Great Again means the very same thing. It means it's a license to discriminate, to go back to waving the Confederate flag, you know, and all that that stands for. And if you go back and study history, now you go back and look at history, since you're a history major, you'll find out was the emblem of the Klan, and that they were using that in order to perpetuate this separation of races. And so it is not, it is, yeah, it says what it means. And we have to fight against that each and every generation because they try to legitimize it. They bring it out and say, oh, it doesn't mean that. These Confederate statues, yeah, they mean exactly what they symbolize. A time when we were able to do what we wanted to you, and there was nothing you could say about it. And it was not, you know, it was a time of separate but unequal. It was a time of when we could lawfully, legally. And so that's what we're fighting against in the courts. It's ironic. Things go around in cycles and in circles. So, you know, there was a time when we ran to the federal courts to try to get justice. And now we have to run to the state courts and try to stay away from the federal courts. And so now you're seeing some of the greatest gains that will be gained in North Carolina under the North Carolina Constitution, where they will be interpreting, you know, that's why they struck down the recent gerrymandering laws for the legislature, and hopefully will soon do that for the congressional seats, because now the federal courts are saying, no, you can't come to us. That's for political matters, and we can't do it. They're shutting the federal court systems. It has been a purposeful effort to stack the judiciary, not only in the federal system, but in the state systems of our nation, in order to deny access to justice, because this is where we have been able to gain victories. There's been a conscious effort to take away our rights to vote again, because that's where the ballot box is where we have gained victories. And that is why it's so important that your generation vote. You, right now, I was listening to NPR this morning as I was riding, and actually there are more millennials who voted in the last election in 2016 than baby boomers, my generation. So just think what would happen if more of you voted. This last presidential election was won by just a slight number of votes. And so if you could coalesce around, say, well, you weren't excited about Hillary. Many of you weren't excited about Hillary Clinton. The lesser of two evils. It's better to get excited about somebody that that may have some virtue versus somebody that has no virtue, because they've already made clear what they're going to do if they continue in office. And so we have to form coalitions. We have to begin to find and to put candidates out there who will advocate for the common good and not allow for the further eradication of our rights. We cannot allow the clock to be turned back. And that's exactly where we are in America right now. And we have lost, we shed too many tears and too much blood. Too much blood. And see, you're a history major, so again, we have a responsibility to tell the history to the present generation, so you will know what sacrifices were made at what cost. Just by me sharing my story, you understand that the fight must continue, and that you have to be part of it. There are different ways to fight. We can't all fight the same way. But each part of us is a part of the battle for equality and justice in this country, okay?
Well, Reverend Allen, thank you so much for that. This tape is obviously, we're going to edit it. It's going to be archived. We'll try to get you a copy. Not that we'll try to get you a copy. We'll get you a copy.
Okay.
But it will definitely touch an array of people and generations to come, and hopefully your words will resonate with them like they have with me, my partner, and all of us at UNCG that are working this project. And it's...
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.